The sound started early that morning when the sun was still low behind the trees and mist lay across the field like a blanket, the kind of morning Daniel Carter loved, quiet, still untouched. But that day something broke the silence, a heavy thud followed by another, then the growl of machines. He stepped out onto his porch, his coffee still in hand, and frowned. The air trembled with the sound of engines hammering and shouting. It was coming from the far side of his property, the one that bordered the ridge his father had left him in the will. He walked down the gravel path, the crunch under his boots matching the rhythm of the drills. When he reached the fence line, he froze. Beyond the wooden posts stood a line of bulldozers tearing through the earth, the soil flying into the air like smoke, men in bright vests shouting directions, piles of lumber and concrete forms scattered everywhere, and in the middle of it all a giant yellow sign that read, "Future Site of Oak Valley Estates, a proud HOA community." Daniel blinked once, slowly, disbelief washing over him, then anger, then something colder. He set his cup down on a fence post and walked toward the crew. One of the men, a big man with a sunburnt neck, turned his head and shouted over the engine, "Hey, sir, you can't be here." Daniel kept walking, his voice calm, steady. "This is my land." The man laughed, shaking his head. "No, sir, this belongs to Oak Valley Development Company. We've got county approval and everything." Daniel held out his hand. The foreman frowned and handed him a paper. Without hesitation, Daniel unfolded it, the wind catching the corners. A stamped permit signed by a county official, the coordinates printed neatly across the top. Daniel's eyes scanned the page slowly, then stopped. He looked back up at the man and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no warmth, only knowledge. "Thank you," he said politely, handing it back, then turned and walked away. The foreman called after him, "Everything okay, buddy?" Daniel didn't answer. He just kept walking back up the hill, his boots kicking dust, the faintest trace of a smile still on his face, because what the man didn't know, what no one in that construction site could possibly understand, was that the dirt they were tearing through wasn't theirs, it was his, all of it, and every nail they hammered, every foundation they poured was sinking deeper into a trap he had designed long ago, not out of greed but out of foresight and patience, the kind of patience his father had taught him when he was a boy walking this same land, telling him always keep the ground but let them forget who it belongs to. By noon the noise grew louder, trucks came and went, heavy machinery rolled across the ridge. Daniel watched from his porch, silent, taking note of every company logo, every truck number, every direction the water lines were being dug. He wasn't angry, he was calculating. Behind the calm look in his eyes, a storm was building, but not the kind that burned fast, it was the slow kind that destroyed from the inside. He went into his house, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a metal box. Inside it lay an old leather folder, cracked at the edges, filled with documents yellowed by time. He laid them on the table. The first page, the original deed signed by his father decades ago. Then another page, the trust agreement transferring the subterranean rights, mineral access, and foundation layers directly to Daniel Carter Trust. He read it slowly, like rereading a memory, each word carved into his mind. It was the trap, a legal one, invisible above ground, but absolute beneath it. He had learned early how developers worked, how HOAs formed fast, promising community beauty order while swallowing land piece by piece. They always ignored what they couldn't see, and that was their mistake. Daniel had registered the deeper ownership quietly, never contesting the sale of the upper parcels. When the county rezoned, he had smiled, knowing that the land's skin might change hands, but the bones would always be his. Now, as he listened to the hum of machines drilling into those same bones, he whispered softly to himself, "You finally took the bait." Later that afternoon, a black SUV rolled up the driveway, two men in suits stepping out, one of them with a clipboard. Daniel recognized the type, developers, smooth talkers wrapped in fake concern. They approached him smiling. "Mr. Carter, we wanted to introduce ourselves. I'm Greg Miles, president of Oak Valley HOA. And this is Mike Taylor, our project manager. We just wanted to make sure everything's okay since our construction borders your property line." Daniel nodded, polite, quiet, his voice even. "I suppose it's fine as long as you stay on your side." Greg laughed, his smile wide, his tone friendly. Of course, though I think the survey shows our boundary extends a bit past that tree line." He pointed casually. Daniel followed his finger, then looked back at him slowly. "That's strange," he said, "because my survey says otherwise." Greg chuckled. "Up paperwork, you know how messy those old county records can get, but don't worry, once the homes are up we'll make this area beautiful. Property value will triple. Maybe you'll even want to sell." Daniel looked at him for a long second, his eyes calm, unreadable. "Maybe," he said softly, "or maybe I'll just wait and see how it all works out." Greg smiled, not realizing he was already being measured, weighed, and dismissed as Daniel's next move. When they left, Daniel stood at the edge of the field again, the bulldozers pushing deeper, carving roads across his land, dust swirling like fog, the sound of hammers echoing down the valley. He felt no rush to stop them, not yet. Every house built would make the trap tighter, every dollar spent would dig their grave deeper. He knew the law, he knew that the deeper rights meant every pipe, every foundation, every nail below 6 feet of soil was under his control. The moment they crossed that line, they were Trespassing not on surface property but on structural ground ownership, something the developers rarely checked because no one thought that far down except him. He smiled again, quiet, slow, steady, the kind of smile that meant the game had already begun. That night he drove into town to the county records office. The clerk, an older man, looked up surprised to see him at closing time. Daniel smiled. Mind if I take a look at parcel 17A and 17B records again? The man shrugged. Sure, give me a second. He brought out the files. Daniel flipped through the pages, checking the sale date, the zoning codes, the missing reference lines. He had expected this part of the deed was outdated, deliberately so. When the developers purchased, they had used the public version, not the full registry tied to the trust. They hadn't known what they were missing. Daniel pulled out his phone, took a photo of the pages quietly, then thanked the clerk. As he left, the man asked, something wrong? Daniel shook his head. Not at all, everything's perfect. When he returned home, the valley was dark, the machines silent under the moonlight. He stood by the fence again, staring out at the land that no longer looked like his but still belonged to him, the scent of fresh dirt heavy in the air. He could almost hear his father's voice echoing through the night, the words he had spoken years ago when they buried the trust papers beneath the old oak tree. People will take what they see, Danny, but they never think about what lies below. Always protect the part they can't touch. Daniel looked down at the soil beneath his boots and whispered, I did, Dad, I did. The wind blew softly, carrying the faint sound of crickets and the rustle of leaves, and somewhere in the distance the hollow thud of a hammer striking against something that wasn't supposed to be touched. The next morning Greg returned, this time with a county officer who looked uncomfortable. Daniel met them at the fence. Greg spoke first, smiling that fake HOA smile again. Mr. Carter, we just wanted to confirm the boundaries officially. The officer nodded, holding a tablet with a map. Daniel gestured toward the property line. You can measure all you like, just make sure you're standing on your side. Greg's smile faltered slightly, but he motioned for the officer to continue. They walked the edge, placing orange flags along the dirt line. The officer stopped near the ridge, pointing his scanner, frowning. This can't be right, he muttered. Greg turned. What do you mean? The officer scratched his head. The map's missing an overlay for the underground rights. It's blank. Greg frowned. Underground rights? Who cares about that? The officer shrugged. Just saying it's not mapped. Daniel watched silently, his face giving nothing away. When they were done, Greg thanked the officer and left, promising Daniel he'd be in touch. Daniel watched their car disappear down the road, then turned back to the land, the flags fluttering weakly in the wind. He whispered softly, let them build. Days turned into weeks and the noise became constant, the hum of engines, the clang of steel, the scent of concrete in the air. Daniel woke to it, worked to it, slept to it, each sound a reminder of how close they were to ruining themselves. The new homes began to rise, skeletons of wood and metal stretching across the valley. The sales banners appeared soon after, smiling families in advertisements calling Oak Valley Estates a dream community. Daniel read every sign with quiet amusement. Each slogan felt like a countdown to their downfall, because every promise they made, every dollar they took from buyers, every shovel they pressed into the soil tied them tighter to him, the man they had mocked without knowing it. He kept every receipt, every news article, every photo documenting the progress, not to admire but to preserve evidence, because someday soon, when the noise stopped and silence returned, he would walk into court and take back not what they built but what they built it on. On a late Friday evening, when the sky burned orange, Daniel sat on his porch with his coffee again, the same way he had the day it started. The field beyond now full of half-built homes, wooden frames glowing under the sunset. He watched quietly, the workers laughing, packing their tools, the engines shutting down one by one. He felt the calm stretch through him, the kind that came before a storm. The trap was set, sealed, and perfect. The bait had been swallowed whole. He whispered to himself, almost like a confession to the wind, you built your dreams on my ground, now let's see how long they stand. The last light of the day faded over the horizon, the valley falling into shadow, the sound of distant hammers fading into silence, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of crickets. The night deep and peaceful again, the way it had been before, except this time the peace belonged to him. Days passed and the noise on the valley floor grew louder, the air filled with the rhythm of progress, or at least what the HOA called progress. Trucks rolled through the dirt roads, dust rising behind them like ghosts of forgotten boundaries, but Daniel Carter remained calm, his face quiet, his voice steady. He went about his life as if nothing was happening outside his window to the world. He was just a quiet man watching his land get swallowed, but to himself he was watching his plan unfold exactly as it was supposed to, years before his father had warned him about men like Greg Miles, men who smiled while taking what wasn't. There's men who thought kindness was weakness and patience was surrender. So when his father died, Daniel didn't just inherit land, he inherited wisdom. He spent months studying the property laws line by line, learning every loophole, every buried rule, until he found the one thing everyone missed, the separation of surface and subsurface ownership, that single detail that most developers ignored. He had registered a trust quietly for the underground layers of the property, creating two separate legal Titles: one public, one private. When the county rezoned the valley, the developers had only bought the surface section, while the deeper rights, mineral access, water systems, and foundation claims remained his. He remembered standing at the clerk's desk years ago, signing the last page of the trust, his pen moving slowly, while the clerk joked, "Nobody ever cares about what's below." Daniel had smiled, even then saying softly, "Someday someone will." Now that someday had arrived and the HOA had walked right into the snare, thinking they owned everything because they saw fences and grass, they never checked the ground beneath. They poured concrete, drilled pipes, and laid sewage all inside what legally belonged to him. They had built their kingdom on borrowed bones, and he didn't even need to move a finger. Yet each day he kept a record, a detailed log of every step. They took photos of trenches, coordinates of pipes, copies of permits, every screw, every nail, every error was now evidence, waiting in silence. He didn't call the county or file complaints, that would come later. For now, he wanted them deep enough that when he finally spoke, no one could climb back out of the hole they dug. He spent his nights in his small office under the soft hum of a desk lamp, stacks of papers around him, the old map of Silver Creek Valley spread open, showing the lines his father had drawn decades ago with red ink, marking the underground division. He traced the boundary with his finger, following it all the way to the ridge where the HOA had laid their main drainage system, a line of pipes that crossed 3 separate subterranean parcels, all in his name. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, smiling to himself, not out of arrogance but satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, yet it was preparation. He knew patience was the strongest weapon against people who rushed to profit, because greed always moved faster than caution, and the HOA was already running. One morning, while Daniel checked his mailbox, he found another letter, this one with the HOA seal neatly printed on the corner. It was a notice of community expansion, informing him that construction would extend another half-acre past the original boundary. He chuckled softly. They were expanding even deeper into his land. Perfect. He folded the letter and placed it inside his evidence binder next to the first one. As he walked back toward his house, he saw Greg standing near a half-built foundation, waving with that same smug grin. "Morning, Mr. Carter. We're making great progress." Daniel nodded, not looking up from the binder. "Good for you." Greg puffed his chest. "You'll see, when this is done, property prices will double. I might even convince you to sell your place for a fair amount." Daniel looked up, meeting his eyes, calm, steady. "Maybe someday," he said, then turned away, leaving Greg staring after him, not realizing that the ground he was standing on already belonged to the man he was trying to outsmart. Weeks went by, and the HOA's pride grew along with their construction. The local paper ran a story calling Oak Valley Estates a modern dream community, showing photos of smiling families inspecting unfinished homes. Greg posed in front of the sign, arms crossed, the perfect image of a man who thought he had everything under control. Daniel cut out the article, taped it to the inside of his folder, and wrote across it in pencil, "Not for long." That night, he walked down the ridge, flashlight in hand, checking the boundaries where his underground easement began. He saw workers leaving equipment near the trench, the smell of oil thick in the air. He crouched down, picked up a small piece of pipe tagged with a serial number, and smiled. Every tag, every brand, every coordinate was another layer of proof. He walked home under the moonlight, his boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt, and he thought about how strange it was that sometimes the best traps were made of patience and silence, not ropes or walls. The next morning, he received a call from the county utilities department, the woman on the other end polite but firm, asking if he could confirm permission for the HOA's underground water line. Daniel's eyebrows lifted calmly. He asked permission. She replied, "Yes, sir. They're installing a shared main line crossing multiple properties. Your parcel is listed under Carter Subterranean Trust. We just need approval before connecting." Daniel said softly, "I haven't given any approval yet." There was a pause, then the woman said, "Oh, I see. We'll freeze the request until we get paperwork from your office." "Thank you, sir." When he hung up, he sat still for a long moment, the smile returning to his lips, the silence around him thick with satisfaction. The system was beginning to notice, the first thread pulling loose from their illusion of ownership. He didn't need to expose them yet, he just needed the bureaucracy to question itself. That was how you killed an HOA from the inside, not by shouting but by letting their own paperwork undo them. That evening, Greg came to his gate again, looking irritated. Daniel was on the porch cleaning his tools. Greg called out, "Hey Carter, the county's delaying our water line." "Any idea why?" Daniel looked up from his work, calm. "Maybe they realize something's wrong with the land." Greg laughed. "Yeah, right, the land's fine. Maybe you just like messing with people." Daniel said nothing, only smiled slightly, and went back to his tools. Greg frowned but didn't push it, walking away, muttering under his breath. Daniel watched him leave and thought about how arrogance always made men blind. They never looked down until the ground gave way beneath them. By late summer, the valley was filled with houses half finished, the HOA proudly posting updates online, the number 98 written in bold, announcing the total homes built on their private community land. Daniel scrolled through the website amused by how much pride they took in their mistake. They had built their own evidence, their own confession in public view, every photo, every caption showing new pipes, concrete slabs, irrigation systems, all tied to the ground he owned. He downloaded everything, saving it in his case folder titled Oak Valley Incident. One evening, he looked through the folder, hundreds of photos, dozens of permits, countless signatures, and whispered almost to himself like a prayer of patience, "Keep building, Greg, keep digging, because the deeper you go the harder it will be to climb out." That night he stood at the edge of his land, the moon hanging high, silver light reflecting off the bulldozers below. He could hear faint laughter from the workers finishing their shift, and for a moment, he thought about how quiet it would all be once this was over, when their voices would fade and only his would remain. The land would be still again, not because he destroyed them, but because they destroyed themselves. He turned back toward his home, the wind brushing against his face, carrying the faint scent of soil and steel. He whispered softly to the darkness, "You think this is your land, but every inch you touch, every pipe you bury, every foundation you pour belongs to me already." The night answered him with silence, the same silence he had waited years to hear before the storm of justice began. By the time autumn came, the once empty valley had turned into a sea of rooftops stretching from one end of the ridge to the other, 98 homes lined neatly like soldiers under a flag of arrogance. And Greed Oak Valley Estates. The name gleamed in polished gold letters across a stone entrance gate surrounded by trimmed hedges and fountains. Daniel Carter watched it all from his porch, the same quiet spot he'd stood months ago when the first bulldozer arrived. The sound of children playing faintly carried through the wind, new families moving in, unloading furniture, smiling for pictures with Greg Miles, the proud HOA president, standing beside them holding clipboards and champagne glasses as if he were some kind of hero. The man had even organized a ribbon-cutting ceremony, inviting local officials, the news, the county representatives, to celebrate the success of his development. Daniel stood in the back, blending into the small crowd, hands in pockets, eyes calm as Greg took the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers about unity, community, and progress, every word slick with pride. He spoke of how Oak Valley Estates represented the future of suburban living and how the HOA would ensure order and beauty for generations. People clapped, cameras flashed, children waved little flags. Daniel didn't clap, he just smiled faintly, because he knew those same words would one day echo in court as the foundation of a lie. When the ceremony ended, Greg spotted him and walked over, that smug grin never leaving his face. "Mr. Carter, glad you could make it. I was hoping you'd see what we built." Daniel nodded, glancing around quietly. "You've done a lot of work." Greg laughed proudly. "We sure have. 98 homes sold in record time, property prices through the roof. Even the county is impressed. You see, this is how progress works. Old land becomes new opportunity." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone stayed calm. "Progress is good as long as it's built on something solid." Greg chuckled, assuming it was praise. "It's solid, all right, best engineers in the business." Daniel smiled, barely noticeable. "We'll see about that," then walked away, leaving Greg frowning, unsure if it was approval or warning. As the weeks passed, the HOA became louder, stronger, prouder. Letters went out to homeowners listing new community rules, lawns trimmed to exact length, mailboxes matching color palettes, noise ordinances, fines for decorations, even driveway parking limits, everything under Greg's control. The man who once begged investors now ruled a small empire from his glass office in the community hall, his ego growing faster than the homes around him. He often bragged during meetings that Oak Valley was built on the cleanest, most secure land in the county. Daniel would sometimes attend those meetings quietly at the back, unnoticed by most, but not by Greg, who always glanced at him nervously between speeches. Daniel would listen calmly, taking mental notes on every policy, every expansion, every dollar allocated for underground maintenance, because all of it was tied to the ground that belonged to him. One night, during a heated HOA meeting, when a homeowner complained about water pressure, Greg snapped, saying, "Maybe if the city had done its job right, we wouldn't have issues." Daniel lifted his head and said softly, "Maybe the problem isn't the city, maybe it's what you built on." Greg froze, his voice caught mid-sentence, and for a moment the room went quiet before Greg forced a laugh, pretending not to hear the warning. The next day Daniel received another letter, this one thicker than the rest, written directly from Greg. It was a complaint against his farmhouse, stating that his old wooden fence didn't meet the new community aesthetic and should be replaced within 30 days. Daniel sat at his table reading the letter over and over, the absurdity almost making him laugh. They had built on his land, and now they were trying to fine him for how he kept his fence. He folded the paper carefully, placed it in a folder labeled Evidence, and whispered softly, "They really have no idea at all." The audacity of Greg and his board didn't anger him, it confirmed how blind they were. They believed power came from paperwork, not ownership, from titles, not truth. But Daniel knew better. Real power came from silence and patience, because silence gave arrogance enough rope to hang itself. A week later, Oak Valley hosted its first official community fair. Bright banners lined the streets, food trucks filled the air with the smell of barbecue, laughter echoing across the valley, the residents proud of their new homes, unaware they stood on borrowed earth. Daniel walked among them. Unnoticed children ran past him with painted faces. Homeowners bragged about square footage and mortgage rates. Greg stood at the main stage shaking hands with county inspectors, reporters, snapping photos, his wife smiling beside him, the image of success. But Daniel's eyes weren't on the surface. He looked at the trenches where the utility lines ran beneath the roads, at the manholes marked with his trust code still engraved faintly on the metal. He smiled to himself quietly, knowing that the deeper the HOA rooted itself, the tighter his control became. Every house connected to his underground veins, every pipe, every line, every inch of the foundation tethered legally to him. They thought they owned homes, but they were standing on leased bones. As the sun began to set, the lights across the valley flickered on one by one. Daniel stood at the edge of the fairground watching as music played. Laughter filled the air. Greg raised a glass, giving another proud speech, thanking the HOA board, the builders, the community. He ended his speech with a smug smile, saying, "Oak Valley will stand for 100 years." Daniel's voice carried softly on the wind. "Not if it's standing on my land." Greg didn't hear him. But the ground did, the wind did, the valley did, and somewhere deep beneath the concrete, where the pipes twisted through soil that belonged to Daniel, it was as if the land itself was listening, waiting for the moment when the pride above would crumble under the truth below. That night, as the fair ended and the fireworks painted the sky, Daniel sat on his porch, the sound of distant celebration still echoing. He stared at the valley lights blinking like stars across the dark earth, his face calm, his thoughts sharp. The trap was almost complete. Every document, every legal right, every dollar they invested was now anchored in the one thing they didn't own, the one thing they could never take, the ground itself. He whispered softly to the night, "Let them dance, let them celebrate. Because when it all comes down, they'll finally see what they built wasn't a neighborhood, it was a monument to their own ignorance." He leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of engines from the valley fading into the night, replaced by silence again, the kind of silence that belonged to men who knew they didn't need to fight loud to win, they just needed to wait. Winter came early that year, the morning air sharp and cold, but the noise of Oak Valley never stopped. Construction trucks rumbling down the paved roads as workers rushed to finish the last few homes before the holidays. Daniel Carter watched from his porch, the fog rolling through the valley, the smell of wet cement carried by the wind. His land, now covered by 98 homes, all painted bright white with matching mailboxes and fake smiles. The HOA had grown louder, bolder, their meetings full of pride and ignorance. Greg Miles walked around like a king, greeting residents with fake warmth, reminding everyone that Oak Valley was a model of perfection. But beneath all that noise, trouble was quietly brewing. The first signs came when a group of homeowners complained about low water pressure. Some said their lawns were flooding, others said their sinks ran dry. The HOA called in plumbers, but no one could explain the problem until one morning a contractor knocked on Daniel's door. Holding a clipboard and looking nervous, he asked politely, "Sir, do you know who owns the underground water rights here? Because our blueprints don't match the county maps." Daniel looked at him, calm, quiet, his voice steady. "Yes, I know exactly who owns them." The man blinked, waiting for an answer. Daniel smiled faintly. "You're standing on his property." The contractor frowned, not understanding, but when he showed Daniel the map, the truth was right there. The entire waterline system ran through parcels marked Carter Subterranean Trust. It was the first crack in their illusion, and Daniel knew exactly how to widen it. That evening he sat at his desk under the warm glow of a lamp, typing a letter, not angry, not emotional, just factual, precise. It read, "You are hereby notified that Oak Valley Estates is occupying land legally owned by the Carter Subterranean Trust. You are advised to cease all underground activity and discuss lease terms immediately. Failure to comply will result in legal action within 30 days. He printed it on thick paper, signed it with a pen that had once belonged to his father, and sealed it in envelopes, one for Greg, one for the county, one for the HOA's legal counsel. The next morning, he walked down to the community hall where Greg and the board were holding their weekly meeting. The room smelled of coffee and fresh paint. Daniel walked in quietly, handed the envelopes to the secretary, and said calmly, "These are for the board." Greg looked up from his seat, his smile fading when he saw Daniel's expression. "What's this?" Daniel said softly. "It's notice of trespass." Greg scoffed, standing up, waving the paper like it was a joke. "You're kidding, right? You can't own the underground of an entire neighborhood." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You might want to read before you laugh." Greg chuckled dryly, shaking his head, his arrogance still intact. "Nice try, Carter, but we've got county permits and inspectors backing us up. You can't scare me with your old farm paperwork." Daniel didn't argue. He just turned to leave and said quietly, "You should take the warning seriously. The law already has." For days Greg laughed about it at the clubhouse, mocking Daniel's letter during meetings, calling him the crazy old landowner with too much free time. But the laughter started to fade when the county utility office called, demanding clarification on ownership rights. The pipes had burst again, this time under the main road. The insurance inspector refused coverage, citing a pending property dispute. Greg's voice cracked when he called Daniel, shouting over the phone, "What the hell are you doing, Daniel? Answered calmly, "Nothing, you're just standing where you shouldn't be." Greg cursed, slammed the phone down, but the seed of fear had already been planted. The HOA hired a law firm to review the claim. The lawyers came confident, ready to crush an old farmer with their arrogance. They didn't expect Daniel to show up at their office with copies of deeds and trust documents dating back 40 years. The head lawyer flipped through the pages, his face turning pale halfway through. "These are legitimate," he muttered. "These documents mean the HOA doesn't own a legal foundation to any of their homes." Daniel smiled. "That's exactly what it means." The lawyer looked up, speechless. Daniel stood and said softly, "I warned them. Now it's your turn to tell them what it costs to stay." Within a week, panic began to ripple through Oak Valley. Meetings turned chaotic. Homeowners demanding answers. Some had already received letters from their mortgage companies refusing to process refinancing until ownership was verified. Others discovered their insurance policies void due to foundation disputes. Greg tried to calm them with his usual charm, but his voice trembled. The same man who once ruled with confidence now avoided Daniel's gaze. Whenever their paths crossed, Daniel didn't rub it in. He didn't need to. The silence of his confidence was enough. The HOA held an emergency session behind closed doors, the board members arguing, shouting, some even resigning. When Greg admitted that Daniel's claim was real, still they refused to yield. They called another lawyer, who promised to fight it in court. Daniel let them. He knew every dollar they spent would only dig their hole deeper because the law was on his side and he had written it himself. A few nights later, Daniel sat by the window, rain tapping against the glass, watching headlights pass through the fog. He thought about his father, the man who had taught him that patience was not the absence of action but the control of it. He remembered the last time his father walked the ridge, telling him never fight a thief while he's still holding the stolen goods. Wait until he builds a house on them, then take it back with interest. Daniel smiled softly, the reflection of his old home glowing in the window, now replaced by the faint lights of 98 homes built on stolen ground. His ground. He whispered quietly, "They were warned and ignored it. Now they'll learn what happens when you build pride on someone else's soil." By the end of the month, the HOA received a formal letter from the county attorney's office confirming that the Carter Subterranean Trust held full ownership of the land beneath Oak Valley's infrastructure. The HOA was ordered to negotiate leasing terms or face injunctions on all future development. The panic turned to chaos. Homeowners began showing up at Greg's door, shouting, demanding refunds, asking why they hadn't been told. Greg shouted back, desperate, his composure finally cracking. Daniel watched it all quietly from his porch, the distant sound of arguments and car doors slamming, the wind carrying fragments of broken pride. He didn't feel joy. He felt justice, slow, quiet, and heavy, the kind of justice that didn't need fire or fury, only time. He walked back inside, placed the original trust document back in its folder, and whispered softly, "You had your chance to walk away, but greed never listens until it's too late." That night, the rain finally stopped, leaving the valley soaked and glistening under the streetlights. The new homes reflected faintly in puddles that shimmered like glass. Daniel stood at his window, watching the reflections distort as the wind rippled through the water, each movement like a reminder that surface beauty never lasts when the ground beneath isn't yours. He turned off the light, letting darkness reclaim the room. The only sound left the faint drip of water from the gutters, the echo of his father's voice in memory saying softly, "People forget, land remembers." And Daniel smiled, knowing that the land had remembered everything. The lawsuit came like thunder on a quiet morning, the kind that no one expects but everyone deserves. When it finally hits, Greg Miles had been pretending everything was fine, sending cheerful newsletters to the homeowners about temporary legal adjustments. But the mask cracked the moment a thick envelope from Carter and Associates landed on his desk, stamped with the county seal, Daniel Carter's name printed neatly on the front. Inside, the papers were simple, direct, and devastating: a formal lawsuit for unlawful construction, trespass of subterranean property, and illegal use of foundation infrastructure. The claim was clean, airtight, and backed with decades of proof. Greg's hands shook as he read it, his face draining of color. His assistant whispered, "Should we call our lawyer?" Greg didn't answer, his mind spinning with panic. By the afternoon, news had spread through the HOA community, threads online filled with fear and confusion, homeowners asking if they were about to lose their homes, some demanding answers, others blaming Greg. The same man who had stood smiling at every ribbon cutting now sat in his office staring at the wall as the sound of his phone ringing again and again filled the room. Daniel watched all of it from his porch, quiet, calm, the papers already filed with the court clerk, his evidence binder heavy with the weight of patience. He wasn't after money, he was after truth, and this was how it began. When the first hearing date was announced, the courtroom filled quickly, reporters, photographers, homeowners, all curious to see what kind of man could take down an entire HOA. Daniel walked in wearing a simple gray suit, the same one he wore when he buried his father years ago, his expression unreadable, his step steady, as if he was walking across familiar ground, which in a way he was. The opposing table looked polished, expensive. Greg sitting beside his lawyers, who whispered in low tones, one of them Smirked as Daniel sat down thinking this would be easy. The judge entered the room. Everyone stood and silence fell, the air thick with tension. The HOA's lawyer spoke first, confident and rehearsed, claiming that the Carter Trust was a misunderstanding of old documentation and outdated legal technicality. Daniel let him finish, then stood calmly, walked to the center of the courtroom, and placed a folder on the evidence table, opening it slowly, revealing the original deeds, the trust documents, the county registrations, all notarized and sealed. He spoke softly, but his voice carried across the room. Your Honor, this isn't a misunderstanding. It's ownership. The ground beneath Oak Valley Estates, including the structural foundation layers, water lines, and utility easements, belong legally to my trust. They built 98 homes without authorization and used my land for profit. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Let me see those documents. The room fell into a tense silence, only broken by the sound of papers flipping and the faint clicking of cameras. The HOA lawyer tried to interrupt, waving a new survey map, claiming it proved their ownership, but Daniel turned to him with the calm precision of a man who had already won. That survey was built on false data from 1997. He said the land was rezoned in 2002, and the subsurface division was recorded under Carter Subterranean Trust. Here's the timestamp, certified by the county clerk. The lawyer froze, looking at the document, speechless. The judge frowned at him, then turned to Greg. Mr. Miles, were you aware of this before construction? Greg's mouth opened, but no words came. He stuttered. Your Honor, we had county permits. The judge said quietly. Those permits covered surface rights, not subsurface ownership. That means every home you built sits illegally on another man's property. Greg's face went pale. Whispers filled the courtroom. One reporter's flash went off, the sound sharp like lightning. Daniel stood still, unmoving, his eyes steady, fixed on Greg's panic, not with satisfaction but with the calm of justice served. The HOA's lawyers scrambled, trying to propose settlements, but Daniel remained quiet. Every offer they made he refused politely. One lawyer suggested a large payout to resolve the confusion. Daniel replied softly, it's not confusion, it's theft. Greg shouted across the courtroom, we built a community, we made this place worth something, you can't take it all away. Daniel turned his head, slightly meeting his eyes. I don't have to take anything, you already built it for me. The words hung in the air, heavy, final, unshakable. The judge called for order, the gavel striking hard, echoing through the chamber. By the end of the day, the verdict was clear. The Carter Subterranean Trust held legal ownership of all underground foundation rights, and Oak Valley Estates had no authority to occupy the land without a lease or removal order. The judge's final words struck harder than any hammer used in construction. Mr. Carter, the law recognizes your claim and grants full control over the disputed land beneath Oak Valley Estates. The courtroom erupted, the noise of disbelief and anger filling the air, reporters shouting questions. Greg slumped in his seat, his empire collapsing in one sentence. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, crisp, lighter. Daniel stood on the steps as microphones and cameras surrounded him, flashing lights reflecting in his calm eyes. One reporter asked, what will you do now, sir? He smiled faintly, I'll do what they should have done in the first place, respect the land and the law. Then he walked away, leaving the chaos behind, while Greg's voice echoed faintly somewhere inside, yelling about appeals, lawsuits, revenge. But Daniel knew those were the last desperate shouts of a man who built his kingdom on stolen earth. He drove home in silence, the road winding through the valley. He owned again, the lights of the homes flickering in the distance, each one standing like a reminder of how greed blinds even the smartest men. He parked by his porch, stepped out, and stood under the open sky, breathing deeply, the scent of his land fresh after the storm of noise and lies. He whispered softly to the dark, it's done. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't over yet, because taking down an HOA in court was one thing, but watching it crumble under its own weight would be another, and that was the part he planned to watch quietly from the same porch where it had all begun. That night he sat at his table, the documents neatly stacked beside a cup of cold coffee. He read through the verdict one last time, his father's signature faintly visible at the bottom of the original trust. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the paper's age, the texture of legacy, then folded it carefully and placed it back inside the metal box where it belonged. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, whispering through the valley like an old voice saying it remembers. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, letting the silence settle around him before whispering back, I told you, Dad, they'd come for it, and I waited till they did. The fall of Oak Valley Estates did not come with explosions or drama. It came quietly, like rot spreading through a perfect apple. First the banks pulled out, then the insurance companies followed, one by one. The pillars that held Greg Miles's empire began to crumble. The judgment had gone public, and the news spread faster than any of Greg's press releases. Homeowners who once smiled at him at barbecues now crossed the street to avoid him. Angry letters poured in, threatening lawsuits, demanding refunds. Some even taped notes to his office door calling him a liar and a thief. The local news ran a segment titled The HOA That Built on the Wrong Land, showing drone footage of the valley gleaming under the sun while the Reporter's voice said these homes are now part of a massive property rights disaster. Daniel watched the broadcast from his living room, his dog lying at his feet, the faint glow of the television reflecting in his eyes. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he just watched in silence, because this wasn't joy, it was justice arriving in slow motion the way he always knew it would. He turned the TV off and listened to the wind outside the valley that had once been loud with machinery and laughter now hummed with uncertainty. Whispers of lawsuits, debt, and panic carried through the streets that once boasted perfection. By the end of the month, half the residents had packed up and left for good. Moving trucks lined the roads, the new lawns already dying under the autumn chill. Greg's office lights stayed on late every night, papers piling up on his desk, desperate letters to lawyers, to the county, to the banks, begging for help, but no one could undo what had been done. He had built his dream on another man's foundation, and now every inch of it was sinking under the weight of his arrogance. One afternoon, as Daniel walked his fence line, he saw Greg standing at the old HOA sign, staring at it like a man who'd lost everything. The once polished wood now chipped, the gold letters dull. Greg turned when he heard Daniel's footsteps, his face pale, his voice hollow. "You destroyed everything." Daniel stopped a few feet away, his tone calm. "No, Greg, you did that yourself." Greg shook his head. "This can't be legal, it can't be fair." Daniel looked at him. "Evenly fair is when you respect what isn't yours." "You didn't." He walked away, leaving Greg standing alone as the wind tore one of the letters from the sign, sending it spinning down the empty street. Over the next few weeks, Daniel received calls from the banks offering to sell him the foreclosed properties at a fraction of their worth. He didn't hesitate. He bought each one quietly through the trust, one by one, until Oak Valley Estates was his again, not by force, not by trickery, but by the same law that Greg had ignored when it worked in his favor. By winter, he owned every lot, every road, every house. The once proud HOA board now dissolved, its members scattered in shame. Greg filed an appeal, but it went nowhere. The court reaffirmed the original judgment and added damages for fraudulent development. He tried to hide, but reporters found him anyway, the man who built the dream neighborhood that collapsed overnight. Daniel never spoke to the press. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. Every newspaper headline, every angry interview, every broken family that left their home was proof that his father's lesson was right. You never need to fight people who steal from you, just let them build higher. The fall will hurt more. The valley grew quiet again, no laughter, no construction, only the wind moving through empty streets, streetlights flickering over for sale signs that no one came to read. Daniel would drive through sometimes just to see the stillness, the paint already peeling from the houses, the once green lawns brown and dry. It wasn't satisfaction. He felt it was closure. He had never wanted revenge, only respect, and the land finally had it back. One morning he stopped his truck in the middle of the road, stepped out, and listened to the silence. It was heavy like memory, the kind that carried weight. He looked around and whispered softly, all this noise, all this greed, and in the end it came back home. A month later, the paperwork for the final transfer arrived, making Daniel the full legal owner of the entire Oak Valley property, 98 houses built by someone else, now resting quietly on the soil that had always belonged to him. He signed the last document with a steady hand, the ink smooth against the page. He sat back in his chair, the sunlight spilling through the window over the papers, the same light that had once shone on bulldozers tearing through his land. It felt different now, peaceful. Pure outside birds moved through the trees, and the faint sound of wind chimes came from somewhere far away. The valley no longer felt stolen, it felt alive again. He thought of his father's voice whispering through the years, "Protect the ground, and it will protect you." And for the first time, Daniel truly understood what that meant. The land had waited patiently while others disrespected it, and when the time came, it had taken itself back through him. In the last days of winter, Greg's house, the last one still occupied, went dark. His car gone, his office emptied. Rumors said he'd moved away to another town, trying to start over, but Daniel didn't care. He didn't need to follow a man already broken. Instead, he focused on rebuilding not the HOA's dream, but his father's. He reopened the old Carter farm, converted some of the empty homes into community housing, rented others to families who needed help. No HOA rules, no fines, no committees, only peace. People came slowly, at first curious, then grateful. The valley began to breathe again, laughter returning in small soft doses, real this time, not forced by rules but born of respect. Daniel would walk those same streets in the evenings, the orange sunset painting everything in gold, the air quiet except for the rustle of leaves, and he would think about how strange justice could be, how it never needed anger or violence, only time and truth working together like the steady pull of gravity, silent, invisible but unstoppable. One night he stood at the ridge overlooking the entire valley, the lights of the few remaining homes flickering like stars below him. He remembered the first day. He had heard the bulldozers the first time. He had seen Greg's smug grin the first night. He had sat under the lamp drafting the trust papers. All those moments that felt small at the time now seemed like pieces of something bigger, a quiet battle fought not with fists but with patience. He closed his eyes, breathed in the cool air, and Whispered softly, you built your homes on my land, and in the end the land built itself back on you. The wind answered softly, moving through the trees, carrying the faint sound of distant laughter, and for the first time in years Daniel smiled, not out of victory but peace, the kind that only comes when justice is silent and complete. Spring came soft and quiet across the valley, the air smelled of rain, and the sound of birds returned to the land that had been silent for too long. Daniel Carter stood at the edge of what used to be the HOA entrance, the stone gate still standing, but the gold letters had fallen one by one until only the word oak remained hanging crooked on the archway, the rest gone lost to wind and time. He looked down the road where weeds now pushed through cracks in the pavement, sunlight spilling over the rooftops of 98 houses that once symbolized arrogance and greed. Now they stood calm, empty, waiting to be given purpose again. Daniel walked slowly, hands in pockets, boots brushing against gravel, the silence of the place heavy but not sad, more like peace finally settling after years of noise. He reached the old HOA office, its windows dusty, the door hanging slightly open. He stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of paper and stale paint, the same room where Greg Miles had once held his meetings, shouting orders, writing fines, collecting power and fear from his neighbors. Now only the hum of wind through broken glass filled the space. Daniel moved behind the desk, running his hand over its surface, then stopped when he saw a small metal plaque half buried under a pile of folders. It read Gregory Miles, President, Oak Valley Estates. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand for a moment, then set it back down, whispering softly, power never lasts when it's built on lies. In the months after the final court ruling, Daniel began the quiet work of rebuilding, but not the way Greg would have. He didn't bring in bulldozers or developers. He brought people who needed homes, families who had lost theirs in the chaos of rising prices, young couples, veterans, single mothers, men who worked with their hands and respected the ground they stood on. He opened the valley to them without HOA rules, without fines, without arrogance. He called it Carter Ridge, not to honor himself, but to remind everyone who came that land is not power, it's responsibility. He gave each family fair leases, some rent-free, others paying only what they could afford, and in return they helped restore the valley, cleaning gardens, fixing fences, painting walls, until the once ghostly place began to glow with life again. Laughter returned, real laughter, not the forced smiles of an HOA barbecue, but the kind that comes from peace. At dusk Daniel would walk those same streets, watching children ride bikes past mailboxes that didn't need approval, old men sitting on porches sharing stories, the valley breathing again. He never announced what he'd done, never took credit. When local news called to ask how the abandoned HOA community had revived itself, he simply said the land just needed better caretakers. One afternoon, as he walked past the old community hall, now turned into a small library, he heard someone call his name. It was a young man, maybe in his 20s, holding a stack of books. He smiled shyly and said, "Sir, my parents said you saved this place." Daniel smiled back, "No, son, the place saved itself. I just reminded people to listen to it." The young man nodded, not fully understanding but grateful, and Daniel kept walking the path that curved toward the ridge where his father's old farmhouse still stood, rebuilt, stronger, cleaner, the same porch, the same oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the wind. He sat on the steps, the same spot where he had watched bulldozers tear through the earth years ago. Now he watched the sunset, instead the golden light spilling across rooftops that no longer belonged to pride but to peace, the valley glowing like an old memory reborn. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing faint echoes from the past, the hammering, the shouting, the arrogance of Greg's voice, all gone now, replaced by the steady hum of evening crickets and the rustle of leaves. Later that evening, as darkness fell, Daniel lit the old lantern that hung beside the porch. It flickered softly, casting a warm circle of light across the yard. He looked out across the land, whispering softly to the night, "Do you see now, Dad? They tried to take it, but the ground never forgot who it belonged to." The wind moved through the grass like an answer, slow and gentle, the stars beginning to appear above him. He thought about Greg for the first time in months, where he might be, what he might have become, but there was no anger in the thought, only pity, because Greg had built his life on control while Daniel had built his on patience, and in the end patience had won, not loudly, not cruelly, just quietly, like the earth reclaiming itself after a storm. He smiled faintly and leaned back against the porch post, the lantern's glow reflecting in his tired eyes. He had spent years fighting without shouting, waiting without fear, and now the reward wasn't wealth or power, it was peace, the kind that fills the silence and makes you realize you don't need revenge when truth already settled it for you. When the first rain of summer came, Daniel stood outside barefoot in the yard, feeling the cool drops on his skin, the smell of wet soil rising around him, the same soil that had carried his family's name for generations. He looked out toward the valley, the rooftops glistening under the rain, every drop a reminder of cleansing, renewal, the past washing away. He whispered softly, "This is how it should have always been, no rules, no greed, just life growing where it belongs." Behind him, the light from his house glowed softly through the rain, warm and steady, and in that moment everything felt exactly right. He turned back toward the porch, walked inside, and closed the door behind him. The sound of the rain fading into the night outside the valley slept peacefully under the soft rhythm of water falling on roofs, and the whisper of wind through the oak trees. The land had finally found its balance. The man who had defended it didn't need anything more. He had already won in the quiet way that only truth can win.